we have two tremendously important journalists who've had really historic roles in the global dialogue about all the issues the techonomy cares about for some time. First, I see Nick Thompson's already on video. Thank you for being here, Nick. Nick had it really made a huge impact as editor of Wired for quite a few years. I don't know exactly how many, but a lot of years. But now he has made the interesting move to go to the Atlantic as CEO, more on the business side. And I think we may ask you, Nick, before we wrap, why you did that. But that is a secondary kind of question from the standpoint of this conference. Second of all, Lionel Barber, one of the great newspaper editors of the world, especially one of the great business news editors, who was editor-in-chief of the Financial Times for 15 years until just before the pandemic started. So I don't know if you could say he got out in time or he got out too soon, but certainly he has now written a great book, which I have a copy of right here. I hope you can see it. The Powerful and the Damned. It's really a memoir written in sort of very anecdotal fashion with amazing characters. Pretty much every major global leader of the last 15 or 20 years makes an appearance. Although The Powerful and the Damned is a little bit of a grim title, and I want to ask him about that in a minute. But the point is, to have these two guys together is a privilege for us. And we want to continue to sort of touch on this issue of unity if we can. But I'm going to ask Jim to kick off the conversation with a question or two to these guys, and then jump in as necessary. So Jim, take it away.
Thank you, and I want to reiterate David's praise for the book, Lionel. It's this wonderful combination of tiny little snippets that are like very snackable, but at the same time, these profound themes that are moving all around throughout the book. And one of the reasons why I wanted to bring you into this conversation for a conference called Digital United is because during all this period, you are, among other things, overseeing the digital transformation of one of the great storied newspaper, brands in the English language, but a publication that is also I don't know, hidebound is maybe the right word. It's been around for a long time. And I think if the year were 1990 and you were to ask me, which of the great newspapers in the English language would be at the absolute forefront of the technological revolution, I would not have said the Financial Times, in all honesty. I would not have. And yet you made it happen. And so I have sort of two questions about that. The first of which is, how did you do it? What was it like to get buy-in or not get buy-in from the workers, from the board, from Marjorie Scardino? Like, what was that process like, and how did you make it happen?
Well, thanks, Jim. David, thank you very much for those generous comments. I came to be appointed editor at a moment of crisis at the FT. Founded in 1888, so we go back a long way, but we got into trouble after the dot-com bubble, and we hadn't adjusted. We'd not made up our mind about charging for content, and we lost our direction editorially, frankly speaking. We were trying to be a bit more like a general newspaper rather than business and finance. And so I was in New York watching this ship list, and then I got the call, and I was 50 years old, been a long time foreign correspondent, and I thought, you know what, I got to be able to do better than the current lot, and so really it was about just thinking about the three things that matter, and I'm sure Nick's going to talk eloquently about this, but for me it was right. One, we're going to be a premium product, so we got to raise prices. Two, our business model is broken. I remember I said that at the first board. And three, we need to take advantage of digital, that we can become truly global. And the way I put it at the time to the staff and to Marjorie was, we are going to be the news organization, not just a newspaper, of globalization and we're going to be premium. And that was the beginning. And then we could talk about the union.
Well, the flip side of the question is, and you touch upon this. Again, one of the wonderful things about this book is all of the different characters. It's like it's Elon Musk in the morning, and then Mario Draghi in the evening, and then Drinks with Christopher Hitchens, and it's all just so fabulously woven together. But one of the things you talk about when you meet the likes of Dick Costolo of Twitter is that once you've created this digital property, you're suddenly, no longer the center of the world, right? The way that Pearson and the Financial Times have been accustomed to being kings of their realm. Now you're in the realm of Google and Facebook and Twitter, and this is really, one of the themes of this conference is, is there any going back? I mean, is there even hope for carving out a credible role for real, traditional journalism? And Nick, I want to talk to you about this too. In an age that's so dominated by these organizations that, quite frankly, have different values at their core.
Well, it's a great question, a huge question, Jim. Let me just make two observations. When I was the news editor after many years as a foreign correspondent, I used to really wake up in the morning and sweat if the Wall Street Journal had beaten us on a story, and some of Fleet Street. By the time I became editor, I was beginning to be aware that actually, you're going to get beat sometimes, but actually the metrics had completely changed. And what I mean by that is, first, you had the likes of the Bloomberg with very deep pockets wanting to steal some of our best journalists. John Micklethwaite's a great friend, so I won't take it against him, but that was a problem, that it was about recruiting and retaining staff and talent, rather than just worrying about the stories that you might get beaten on. And the second was you had to really think hard about the terms of engagement with these digital giants. And we did two things. One was we were not going to give Apple our data, and we weren't just going to go in the Apple store. We actually created our own web browser. And two, we were not just going to hand over our content to Facebook for a sort of fairly risible sum to help their machine. We were going to stand on our own 2 feet. That's the long and short of it.
It's so interesting what you say about retaining talent in this 21st century context. When I was the editor-in-chief of Inc., you think you're competing with like Fortune and Forbes and Fast Company to some degree, and I lost a senior editor, like the best editor in the shop, to Etsy. I was like, I didn't know I was competing with Etsy, but they went and took her away. Nick, I want to stick on this theme of the role of what we would say proper journalism, traditional journalism, fact-based journalism in an era where a substantial portion of the audience, or at least the potential audience, doesn't seem to care a lot about facts. Like I have really struggled to think about how to present news, how to present fact-based news to people who, believe that Q exists, to people who don't believe that Barack Obama was born in the United States. All of this toxic conspiracy that's spread through social media has poisoned a big portion of the potential audience, and yet you're still supposed to edit for the United States, for a united audience, and how what is the role for what we used to think we were doing to present news and insights to fact-based audience when that audience is seemingly slipping away?
Well, I think the percentage of the population that cares about facts, or the number of people in the United States who care profoundly about facts, is still large enough for The Atlantic or any other serious publication to have a thriving business. If half the country and I can sell 175 million subscriptions, I'll be a happy man. So there's still plenty of people out there who still have not subscribed who we're going to try to reach. But it is extremely hard. And part of the reason why there is so much fact resistance is because of the nature of the social media algorithms, which over time have been trained to lead people into filter bubbles through group recommendations, through the amplification of the most extreme content. And they've really warped the news ecosystem. So I think of the key problem as trying to survive within the contours of the ecosystem that has been largely created by the tech company algorithms. That's one problem. And then a related problem is how as a serious journalistic enterprise, you deal with alternate reality. And, there's one hypothesis that you go out and you find the most prominent false rumors and you squash them. And it seems like that actually it's counterproductive, right? It just adds oxygen to them. And so in some circumstances, it can be very useful. In some circumstances, it can actually make it worse. And so I think it's an interesting question. Again, my job now, as David mentioned in the intro, my job is I'm a bureaucrat and a businessman. I'm not making the editorial decisions. But certainly at Wired, we'd have a lot of intense conversations about, okay, are we going to cover this? Are we not going to cover this? Are we going to say this is false? Are we going to ignore it? And there are different stories that you take different approaches to, but it is an extremely complex question and one that I don't think the media industry did the best job with 4 years ago, 3 years ago, but I think it's now starting to get a handle on.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, from both the business point of view and an editorial point of view, there is also this question of, as a media organization, what levers do you even have? When I was at Time several years ago, there was a lot of hand wringing at the highest levels of people who thought, there aren't enough conservatives on the staff of the magazine. So what do? You kick out the editor the columnist who used to write for the New Republic. You bring in one who used to write for the National Review. You put Ann Coulter on the cover. I don't know that any of that matters. First of all, like, does it even reach the people who are likely to march on Capitol Hill? But also, like, do you feel the need to invent new products and new formats to reach these harder to get audiences, or do you stick to the traditional print magazine plus website and video?
Super interesting. Okay, so there are a couple of elements of that question that I think I can answer. So on the question of how do you reach those people and what do you do? Well, I think that one of the great things about a subscription business model, and Lionel knows this of course too, is that once you're in the business of serving your readers, not serving the mass market, you have a whole different set of incentives, right? So when your primary business model is subscriptions, you redirect your editorial resources to stories that make people subscribe. In the best case scenario, that's a sort of a wide range of really smart factual stories that give people a broad perspective on the world, make them feel an affinity towards you and subscribe. That's certainly what I believed 5 years ago when I worked at the New Yorker. Maybe now it seems like there's also a path to subscription nirvana by publishing the same story repeated over and over again to a relatively small filter group. But regardless, you have better incentives when you're trying to reach subscribers. On the question of the conservative liberal alignment, it is true that was something that came up a lot more when I was younger. But I still think it's important. And I think it's important that because the social media algorithms, because so many incentives in American life, and I think it's true in many countries, but particularly so in the United States, so many incentives push us into narrower and narrower thought segments that it's very important to have people who challenge your assumptions. And some of the people who come from different backgrounds, who come from different parts of the countries, who have different racial identities. And some of it's from people who have different political identities, not just because you want to reach a broader audience, but because if you talk to too narrow a set of reporters, you get the story wrong. When I write, one of the things I try to do, and I don't write much now, but I have, is I try to imagine the biggest critic of the story and of the assumptions I have, right? And I try to put myself in their mind, and then I kind of read the story out loud to them, right? And either I literally call up somebody, a trusted friend who has different views, or I just try to put myself in that perspective. And I think it's very important to have a wide range of people. I just think it makes your work better.
Yeah, I think that's a good method. David, I've taken up all this time with talking about journalism.
No,
you have
this is good.
Bigger picture concerns.
No, that's not whether it's bigger picture or not. One of the things that led us to want to bring the two of you together and to have each of you together and separately is that you are not just great journalists, but practiced observers of the macro scene in which we live. And when I mentioned, Lionel, that your book is called The Powerful and the Damned, it is really, you kind of position the whole book as being about the crisis in capitalism. And you don't seem to have a very positive forward spin on where we're headed from here, if I might say so. And Nick, relatedly, and I hope you guys could just talk amongst yourselves to some degree here, but not only were you the editor of Wired, but when you were there, you and my friend Fred Vogelstein did some excellent journalism about Facebook itself and how it accommodated itself to the right in particular. I thought one piece you wrote, a big piece, was very important. So I guess what I'd love you both to talk about, in a world where, again, a small number of companies, and Facebook in particular, are dominating global media, where division is rampant at every level, what conclusions have you come to about where we're headed? If that's not too big of a question, it is, but I want you to answer it anyway. So Lionel, why don't you start with your hopefully not as negative as I think views, but if they're negative, so be it.
I think I'll also pick up on one or two things that Nick was saying, because they're relevant to any comment I'd make about sort of where are we going. And the book does sort of talk not just about a crisis of capitalism, but of a crisis of liberal democracy. I think America has just about survived a very big test in January, but the two are linked, of course, because we've assumed, not least the way we've interacted with the Chinese, that if they adopted a capitalist model, they might become a little bit more liberal and a bit more democratic. Wrong. And meanwhile, the crisis that we've seen with not just with the global financial crisis, but the COVID and the response that capitalism, unfettered capitalism, has come under great strain. Now, linking up with what Nick was saying, I, as an editor, said what we need to do is really focus on where we have comparative advantage. In other words, we're not going to be distracted by what gets the most clicks or what's making the most noise. We have to focus. We have to be incredibly disciplined, and in the areas that we cover, and what we're really going to put resources into. Now, yeah, it's a bit arrogant that as editor, I was making a lot of those choices and saying, we're going to do this. I think the book explains, given that we went up to 1 million+ readers, that we were getting some things right. But increasingly, second point, the software was starting to drive the journalism. In the old days, the journalists would get the software developers in and say, right, we want this kind of website and we'll do all the design, and they'd sort of take orders. By the end, the software engineers were saying, well, I mean, we can tell you exactly what's being read, and we need a bit more of that. I mean, they'd say that very quietly in my presence. So I would say, you know what? Of course we need to respond to what readers are interested in. But the crucial, and it is a bit of an X factor, the crucial thing is really good editors and really good journalists do two things. First, they surprise. They tell the readers things they didn't know they might be interested in. And the second thing is, people talk about a crisis in journalism. It's not so much that, it's the way in which opinion has increasingly crowded out what I think really matters, which is deep and original reporting.
That was a great statement. I don't know if you answered my question, however, but we could come back to that. Nick, I'm asking a difficult question on purpose. I mean, we've done something sort of ludicrous in many people's view to call this conference Digitally United, as if unity was even a conceivable possibility. But I guess we want to at least toy with the question of whether it could possibly be. But so Nick, you in going to this position as CEO of The Atlantic, having been an editor previously, you are sort of making a statement about taking a bigger picture role in looking at the ecosystem, I guess, as a business player. I don't know how that's relevant, but give me and us your big picture, state of the world opinion, if you would. How bad is it post January 6th with US-China, all this stuff that's happening? Are you fundamentally optimistic or pessimistic going forward? How about that as a way to ask the question?
About liberal democracy, the media, about liberal democracy.
The context in which we live. Yeah, that would include capitalism, liberal democracy, the climate, you name it, everything. Forgive me, but that's what
All
I'm
right.
asking.
Yeah. So I feel like there are a lot of people heading in the right direction on the most important questions, but there are still so many fundamental things going in the wrong direction, right? So the US-China dynamic, which is, by far the most important bilateral relationship in the world, it will determine, the future of whether there will be a conflict between the US and China, which could be destructive to all of humanity. It's a pretty big issue. It is clearly going in the wrong direction. There was not a reset that I would have been particularly happy with the Biden administration. It seems to be continuing Trump's policy. I hate, one of the big articles we wrote at Wired was the tech split between the United States and China, the fear that the internet economy will be split into two different spheres, one dominated by the West, one dominated by the East. That is a catastrophe. It is a particular catastrophe as we move into a world dominated by artificial intelligence. So I find those trend lines disturbing, but I also recognize that you're in a complicated moment of game theory where the United States and China, it is both in their interest to have a different outcome than the one we have right now, and there may be a possible way to get there. On liberal democracy, and again, I'm speaking way too broadly about issues that are much too big, but you pushed me to do this, David, so here we are. So on liberal democracy, again, like the biggest problem with liberal democracy was, what Lionel said. We had this expectation that as China opened up, it would become more free, right? Of course, as this is the, the end of history hypothesis, post-Cold War, right? As technology spreads, as Western technology will all become more democratic. Of course, truth will win out. And that didn't happen, and it's not happening. In fact, the opposite is happening. Liberal democracy, in part, small part, because of the technology platforms, has been eating itself. And authoritarian countries have been on the rise, right? Look at Freedom House's ranking of the number of democracies, the number of authoritarian states. That has not been going in the right direction. On the other hand, as the United States has showed, selecting a new president, withstanding the very strong challenge to our democratic process, there are many forces pushing us in the right direction. On climate change, again, all the indicators are terrible, but we do have ways out, and through promising engineering. And in fact, the vaccine, the United States' response to the vaccine is super interesting as it ties into all of these big questions that you just asked, right? So what did the United States do with the vaccine? We responded worse than anybody else. And we had the worst misinformation, right? And we had the most deaths. We screwed it up more than any other country in the world, probably more than any other country. Maybe Brazil wins, but we're certainly on the podium. But we also did the best work in getting vaccines, right? We got a whole series of vaccines, multiple vaccines developed in this country, and we've rolled out vaccines pretty well. So it shows that, it's this sort of this contradiction between the best response with vaccines and the worst response to the actual crisis shows where the United States is right now, both its flaws and its promise.
David, can I very quickly try and offer you a couple of thoughts to answer your question more directly? First, we are entering a new age. In fact, we probably already have, where it's very, very different from both the static sort of nuclear standoff and wars by proxy that we saw during the Cold War, where the US and the Soviet Union were the great powers, to a world where now, a hegemonic world after the Cold War. The new world is one where the US is still the superpower, but has lost quite a bit of its moral standing. It's been bloodied. It's lost a lot of its treasure by the wars in the Middle East, the whole war on terror, and it got distracted while the second superpower in waiting, China, became more and more powerful, particularly economically, and where you have a new leader who basically wants to challenge the United States, particularly in the Pacific, and also wants to challenge in an economic and commercial and technological sense. And the third actor is the agent of disruption, Russia. Now, all these, I'll stop, but the key point, which is related to this conference, is of course that technology allows this contest to be played out in very different ways. And you've seen that with the way in which there was a concerted effort to undermine public confidence in American democracy. There were self-inflicted wounds, but this is the new context. And so everybody is adjusting. I could go on, but the most important thing in that, the summary I'd say is we need to sort of reaffirm what the values of liberal democracy, and the media has a very important role to play in that respect.
Yes. Nick, if you have any response, go ahead and give it, or I could ask a concrete question if you want. Which would you prefer?
I will say that I'm going to use the last sentence that Lionel said as a pivot to the question you mentioned in the prologue, which is, hey, Nick, why did you move from being an editor-in-chief to being a businessman? And the answer to that question is a deep sense that there is a real responsibility for media in liberal democracy and in civic life, and that therefore I love reporting, I love editing, but if I have an opportunity to help a publication of the importance of the Atlantic that has been around forever and has published some of the great work, in the last 150 years in the United States, more than that, then I should take that role, and I should do my absolute best to make sure that I can do everything I can to help the Atlantic thrive for the sake of trying to help there be that media player help the civil society. So Lionel's question leads into my answer to the question you mentioned in my introduction.
Well, good. Unfortunately,
can I also say something on the tech companies?
Please. Yeah, that's what I was hoping you would do. Yeah.
All right. So I have a slightly different view on how to interact with the tech companies, and I think most journalists. So I feel like most of my peers are quite antagonistic, and they're quite antagonistic because of the sort of information sphere warping that Facebook has done, because of the fact that Facebook and Google have taken or won most of the advertising market. And my view is those things are true. And I have spent more time in the last, I would say, 5 years arguing about the Facebook algorithm than almost any other issue. But I also think in media that we live in that reality and that we try to work with that reality. So when I was an editor, I would say, look, when you're assigning a story and when you're writing a story and when you're reporting a story, you don't think at all about the algorithms. You don't write a story because it will do well on SEO. You don't write a story because you think it will go viral on Facebook. But when you're done with the story, then you work your ass off to get it as much distribution as you possibly can on Twitter, on Facebook, and Google. How does the Atlantic get a lot of its subscriptions, right? Or the New Yorker, we used to declaim against Facebook all the time, but how do we get our subscriptions? Well, Facebook advertising is really good, right? Because you can target it to specific users who might be willing to buy subscriptions, right? I'm looking right above your head, David. There's a little thing that says live on Facebook, right? So Facebook has a deleterious effect on, potential advertising market because it won that competition, has a very complicated effect on the news ecosystem, and it has huge benefits that can come to media organizations, right? So when this call is done, I may go back into our Facebook ad spend to try to figure out how to make it exactly optimized so that I can reduce the CPA on our new subscribers, right? So it's a very complex relationship.
Certainly, Nick, our colleagues will be asking you to post something about this conference on Facebook.
Right, and in fact, as a reporting tool, Facebook is an amazing reporting tool in certain ways. So I wrote a story about a hiker who had disappeared.
Crazy story. I loved it.
Crazy story, right? And nobody knew who he was. And for 2 years, people had been hunting him. And I had a hunch, I had some information that his DNA suggested he was from a certain area of Louisiana. And so I bought Facebook ads to that very specific region of Louisiana to get people in the parish where his DNA may have been from to read my story in the process of trying to help identify this guy who'd been missing for 2 years, right? It was a way of amplifying the story. And then whether it was because of that or not, probably not, but maybe it played a role. He was found and I wrote another story about it, right? So there are a lot of tools that technology, and those tools are just gonna become vaster, right? The way that we report 5 years from now using AI, using all the tools that are coming, is going to be extremely interesting to watch. And it's going to be extremely important, I think, for journalists and editors and CEOs to think through all of the benefits that can come from the explosion in innovation.
That's very important.
I want
What Nick's just said about form, using technology to adapt journalistic form. We will know from print to online to multimedia, but there's way more to go on geolocation and other tools, which can really produce much richer journalism and what we know as storytelling.
Yeah.
Lionel, I wanted to ask you a question that's related and as a little bit of a non sequitur right now, but so be it with 3 minutes to go, more or less. Do you think that Trump would have won and Brexit would have happened if Russia hadn't been able to successfully manipulate Facebook?
Yes, I sadly do.
You think they both would have happened anyway?
Yeah, David Cameron's decision was the biggest metropolitan misunderstanding of all time. He stuck there in London and he thought he could win, and the mood of the country was completely it was against, and the other side ran a brilliant campaign. The Russians had nothing to do with Brexit, and you know what, I think I wrote at the time, the editorial on the FT, that Hillary Clinton had more baggage than a Boeing 707, and I think she was a weaker candidate. And I think, I certainly, after Brexit, I had a pretty strong suspicion that Trump was going to win, and my wife even bet on that without telling me.
Okay, here's another question that's related, and that was mildly reassuring. But Belton Road Initiative, which is global, I just saw the other day, I don't know, 78 countries are buying into it to some degree. The idea, I was just reading something that it isn't just about bridges and ports. They're basically going to help them give surveillance technology in most of those countries as well. And then you look at what's happened with the decline of democracy and the rise of autocracy. What government is not going to want to have tools to stay in power if China gives them that? So I guess this is the big picture that I'm concerned about. When we need to come together to fight climate change, we need more democracy for the people of the world to have the power to demand that their lives continue to get better. But it seems to me there's increasing reason to think that the macro combination of geopolitical conflict and technological capability is pushing us in the wrong direction. I'd just like to get either of you or both of you to respond to that as our final question.
Yeah, and then I'll say about the book, by the way, that wasn't my title between us. I actually thought it was a bit too heavy too. Faux Scott Fitzgerald, and said maybe we could do something like "This conversation never happened," but they thought that was too flippant. On Belton Road, debt diplomacy. Don't exaggerate the impact. There is definitely a reaction and blowback of the way the Chinese are using debt diplomacy to pressure these countries. So I don't think it all goes one way.
So you're not pessimistic about democracy in the long term?
No, I'm not pessimistic, but it's a fight, it's a contest, and it's like never before. And America is key, because without America, I am very pessimistic.
But we do have Biden. Yeah. I'm trying to fit a lot in. Sorry, Nick, give us your thoughts on any of this.
I mean, I just think on the last question you asked, that is the most interesting question in foreign policy today. And the challenge will be, how do we get back to the point where there's technological sharing, where there's technological cohesion, and where there's competition, where the world doesn't split into two, where you have a Cold War, where you have a Chinese tech stack with surveillance built in, and Chinese infrastructure and Chinese software, and a Western sphere. That is what we do not want. And we are very much heading in that direction, but there's still time to get off that road.
I couldn't agree more with that statement. Thank you so much. And really, we could have gone on a long time. That's why I was trying to get all these heavy, stupid questions in the short time we had. But thank you, both of you, for joining us. Thank you, Jim, for helping to put this together and helping moderate it. And what a great bunch of stuff to think about. And I feel mildly reassured by listening to Lionel. The FT is a lifeline of sanity, and it has been for at least the 15 years, since the 15 years you ran it. So, and Wired is, and the Atlantic, actually, Wired is great, but the Atlantic is also a lifeline of sanity, and more so in American journalism in the last few years, I think, than in my entire adult life. So, both of you represent what is really promising and hopeful about journalism. So thank you both for that.
Thank you so much, David. Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Lionel.
Thanks, Jim.